Chris, thanks for the time.
Thank you, DK.
Should we start with the first question? How you managed to swindle money from Square Peg? And no, we'll get there.
I feel like you've got as bigger insight on that one as I do.
Yeah, we could spend some time there. Let's go back to the start though. Let's give us a bit of background on yourself. Pre-Amber, what was the journey to Amber? Why? What inspired you to go down this path?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the abbreviated pitch for all those startup founders. You can basically only tell us pitch one way, and so you have to go the whole one. So my background started originally at Boston Consulting Group. So I was consulting for large corporates here in Australia as well as throughout Southeast Asia. And after a few years of that, I actually took a pretty hard right turn and moved to Iran. So I spent 2 years in Iran building an e-commerce business there. So basically trying to build the Amazon of Iran, which, as you can probably imagine, was a pretty unique experience. I joined there about 6 months after the company had launched and ended up becoming one of the 2 managing directors. And we ended up growing that to about 400 people on the team. So it was a real introduction to fast-growing businesses, the good, bad, with its own special mix of Iranian chaos added in there, a chance to make a whole lot of mistakes, as I put it. And then maybe let me actually introduce my co-founder, Dan, which sort of helps lead into Amber a little bit. So Dan's actually the energy side of the 2 of us originally. So he's been renewables for 13, 14 years. Originally at designing wind farms. Then he was at Boston Consulting Group, which is where he and I met. And then he was most recently at Tesla working their virtual power plant projects. And so really Amber is a sort of a meeting of the 2 of our interests of technology and energy. And so we came together in 2017. I always get these years confused, to found Amber.
Awesome. So background, I mean, the Iranian story obviously gave you an insight into sort of leading businesses and running businesses, but very different being a founder. As a co-founder, with Dan, you've got sort of someone there alongside you, but so many unknowns as you go into this journey. What are some of the things that have been easier than you expected? And I'm sure there's a long list of things that have been harder, but love to hear about both of those.
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, what's probably, when I was actually starting Amber, I kind of knew a bit about startups, knew a bit about, what it felt like to be running an organization and some of those managerial challenges. But the thing I had absolutely no idea about was like, how do you get your first customer, right? Like, how do you go from that 0 to 1 journey? How do you actually get a bunch of these fundamentals sort of set up? In some ways, it's much easier to do things when you've got a team around and other people can be experts. But how do you actually balance across all those dimensions when it's a team of 1 or 2 trying to do these things? And so that part I found really challenging and actually found quite overwhelming at the time. There, I certainly felt like I was sort of flailing around at that point in time and just really trying to work out what does this look like. I think for us, we've had a couple of really big advantages. One is that because we actually have 2 co-CEOs, it's actually made, I think, the job of running an organization proportionally easier, right? We've actually been able to divide the roles up, play off each other's strengths and weaknesses, pull each other up at the times that one of us is down. And so that's actually been a part that I think we've found consistently easier than I probably would have envisaged there. We've also been able to play to our strengths consistently. I think that's made parts of the role easier. Like I don't want to quite put it this way, but like fundraising for us has probably been an area of strength for us as a business, and we're able to use that to help drive the business outcomes. And it's something that we both had experience with between our BCG time and then my time in Iran, and that we're able to actually do. And Dan, in a previous life, was in a not-for-profit world and was a pretty prolific fundraiser there. So we've actually been able to use that to our advantage to be able to build those partnerships and relationships, be able to raise capital. So those are probably some of the ones that have been a bit easier than I might have thought 5 years ago.
Let's double click on finding that first customer. I was speaking to someone just before we started and said, what would you like to ask Chris? And actually, as a reminder for anyone who wants to ask questions, Adam and Slido, your questions will be more exciting than mine, so I'll get through mine and then
the spicier the better.
He likes them spicy. So B2C in a legacy industry, massive incumbents, highly regulated. Getting the first customers hard, getting then to 1,000, then to 10,000. Like, how do you think about, how have you guys approach to scaling the B2C or the acquisition side of the business without being sort of the term the person used was pissing away investors' money, but you can answer it however you choose.
We've never pissed away $1 of investors'
No,
money.
I know that.
Don't you worry about. Don't you worry about that. Look, bit of feedback. We've probably gone through different iterations, and when you talk about customer acquisition, in some ways it's not something you solve once and then it's worked forever. It's often something that you've got solved for a period of time and it's working really well, and then it starts to come apart a little bit, and you have to come back in and try and find new channels and new ways. I think one of the lessons I draw on is that the time we've really been successful in customer acquisition has been when we're quite counter-positioned to sort of legacy incumbents there, and when we're doing things that are different. Like for our business over the long term, the fundamental thing is that the product has to be sufficiently differentiated so that we can hold on to customers and have a differentiated competitive position compared to relative incumbents. But that's actually not enough by itself. You can't kind of just pair a differentiated product with a standard go-to-market motion and the same thing that everyone else is doing. And so often you have to be differentiated a little bit. And so, for example, the very first acquisition method that worked well for us was on Twitter. There aren't too many energy retailer CEOs who are on Twitter talking out there and using that as a channel. And that was our sort of first way to be able to get a bit of attention, a bit of breakthrough. I think the first 4 customers were people I begged, pleaded to sign up, and then the next 10 came via Twitter and channels like that. And then one that started actually working really well for us was actually then Facebook advertising in sort of the early days. We were really, really efficient there for the sort of first year or two. And there actually just weren't that many incumbents advertising on Facebook at that point in time. And then increasingly other people start to move into that space there. And so the efficiency of those ones goes down. And so then you're always working for then what's the next customer acquisition one. Increasingly for us, we're actually driving more and more from both our own customer referrals, but also from sort of partner referrals and so on there, which again, once you get into some of those spaces, there's not too many incumbents playing. And so it's certainly been this case that we often feel like we have to try and stay one step ahead of where everyone else is, because even though our product is very, very different than other people's, that on of itself is never enough to just drive the acquisition at the scale that we want to be seeing and that we know we can do.
Let's touch on that as well. I mean, you talked about the product being really, really different, and we have lived in a world where consumers have bought energy in the same way forever. And Amber's model is quite different in terms of, and without going into all the details, but you've gone from buying a single price to buying at the wholesale price. And so you've had to educate the market on the pros and cons of that, what works well, where it works well, what are the challenges. Talk to us a little bit about market education in a world where this is a product consumers don't generally engage with a huge amount of excitement, don't pay a lot of attention to. How have you managed to cut through that?
Yeah, again, it's a really critical question. And again, one that it still feels like an ongoing journey for us, how we do this. It seems to get easier as more and more people have used Amber, have touched Amber at some point, know someone with Amber and can look at the app and feel it. But that education piece is still a huge and probably the biggest challenge for us often in our sort of go-to-market motion. I mean, I think what we have to try and do all the time is try and find the right hooks to bring someone in, right? Like, what's the reason to give someone, for a customer to care? And increasingly for us, that's like a customer either has or are thinking about getting a battery and has this opportunity to earn a whole bunch of money by exporting power at the critical times. And I think probably the next one is going to be that customers have or are close to buying an EV. And so the opportunity to be able to charge that EV at cheaper prices and use more renewables at the same time, starts to become quite compelling. And one of the ones we see for people when they buy an EV is that often their energy bills double. And so all of a sudden their energy goes from being something that they just kind of didn't pay that much attention to that one-off shock creates a moment in the mind to then win a customer and they feel like they've got a problem all of a sudden. So increasingly it's trying to find what's the hook and then what's the simple way to try and take someone on that journey, right? Like, how do you help try and give people a touch of the experience, a simplified version, make it so that when they pick up the app for the first time, it's really delightful, make it so that they can give the app to a friend of theirs, and their friend can look at it and understand it within 5 seconds. These are the things that we really spend a lot of the time on. And I think one of the things that we've actually had as an advantage, certainly in the industry, is design. I think our fourth employee was a designer and a UX designer, and almost everything good has been a result of that work and him and his talent there to really try and find the right level of simplicity and the right way to take complicated ideas and present them effectively for an everyday consumer.
Yeah, not a lot of energy retailers are CEOs on Twitter, and probably not a lot of them thinking about delighting customers either. So that focus really important for you guys. Single best, single worst moment of the journey so far, and on both of them, I really want to focus on with the worst, how you turn that into lessons and take that forward, as opposed to sort of getting bogged down when things go really bad. And on the best side, how you and the rest of the team celebrated it, because I think a lot of times we focus on the road is bumpy, and too often founders aren't spending enough time with their team celebrating the wins when they come. So really want to focus on the so what of the best and worst.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably for me, to be honest, they're actually almost the same period of time, the best and worst time. So last year was certainly the hardest year we've ever had as a business. I won't go too much into it, but anyone who's paying attention to the news, Russia invaded Ukraine, and energy markets worldwide and here in Australia went absolutely bananas and sort of well outside what anyone had ever forecast before. And that provided a whole bunch of challenges for us, right? Like, it was the time there where for some of our customers, all of a sudden we went from being a good deal for them to being something where we couldn't offer them much, and we had some churn for the first sort of time in our sort of company's history where we had some material churn. And obviously these are incredibly hard times, and you're always going to face some really hard times as a business. You don't know what, but I think when you're on the happy path, you should be constantly worried that you've got some bears lying ahead of you in some ways. And so when this happened, we had to sort of decide, how do we respond? How do we move the team through this? What do we focus on? And the choice we made was to actually try and embrace that what was happening, and try and really invest in our technology platform. And especially, the subset of that was invest in the technology we were building for battery owners to be able to help them take advantage of that and take these big steps. And so we basically let a whole bunch of fires in our business just burn, right? Like, and said, we're going to do this one big thing, because if not now, then when? If we're not going to take this opportunity to really try and take this big step forward. And so, we brought the whole company on this journey. We had basically, 70-80% of the company working on this one part of the business, even though, there were fires everywhere and so on. And we're able to get it out and into market and the sort of Amber for Batteries product that we're incredibly proud of. And that then sort of created the best moment, I think, for us was, to have this challenge and then be able to pull together as a company and deliver something really amazing was something that we felt incredible about. And I think, a lot of the November and December period would really, for the team, was celebrating that, across various things and calling it out over and over again. And we had a Christmas party last year that was probably, again, my favorite sort of Christmas party, just because, you've got to be in it for the journey, and you've got to be in it for the times where you do big, hard things and you're able to get them done. And that's kind of, for me, at least, the sweetest feeling of running a startup.
Awesome. And keep those questions coming. I can see a bunch coming through. Maybe last one for me, and then we might start going to the crowd. You've mentioned Dan before, your co-founder and co-CEO. Your roles would have changed a lot over the years. Talk us through some of those things in terms of what are the new skills you've had to learn as your role has changed, and then what are the things you've had to give up on and let go of as the sort of team underneath has continued to grow out.
Yeah, absolutely. So the very first year of Amber, it was actually just me doing the company. Dan and I had sort of the ideas and started the company together, but he was at a point in his time in his life where he just couldn't do a startup. He needed to have a steadier job. So he was at Tesla for the first year, and then only after the first year did he come back and do that. So I actually raised a pre-seed round before him. I was doing that 0 to 1 motion, trying to get the very first customers there. And so a lot of the early times were, particularly when he was back on the ground, was actually then trying to navigate that one of being a single CEO, be able to make all the calls, to then actually having a partner and a co-CEO. managing those communication challenges. And so that was certainly one for me to really, spend a lot of time together with him, really thinking through how do you actually manage those dynamics. And ultimately, it's been, I think, an incredibly successful partnership. We've often divided the company sort of internal, external. So usually I'm the internal CEO and Dan's the external. So I'm sorry, everyone, you're getting the shittier version of the two of us here doing the external facing side. But often it's been trying to work around for us dividing across where are the strengths lying, what can we do that's easier, where our respective energies at, how do we pick these things up. And then I think as the company's growing and you get a team, you do have to pull back. But I mean, I don't pretend to know everything about these ones, but I always try and say as close as I possibly can still, right? Like I think the risk of under-managing is always greater than the risk of micromanaging a team, especially during that growth period. Like people will tell you when they're feeling micromanaged, but if people are being undermanaged and are flailing wildly, they won't often tell you as clearly. And coming back and stepping in to then fix that is really hard. So I've often stayed as close as I possibly can to the customer, to the actual experience, to the product. The advantage of the fact that I was there as a sort of one-person startup for a while was that I'd done all the different roles. I'd done them very, very badly, but I'd done them all, and so I could still engage as we actually had people who were more capable and experienced picking them up and running with them. I could still engage. I could still look at it. I could still spot the context that they might be missing, or the things that didn't make sense here, even if they were sort of best practices elsewhere, and so on and so forth. So that's always been my sort of approach.
Coming back to the point on Dan, there was the question from the crowd, which is a good segue, which is what are some, so your co-founders, obviously there's plenty of businesses that have co-founders, two or more, but that don't become co-CEOs. So particularly on the co-CEO point, what have been some of the trade-offs that and sort of you talked about going from sole decision making, but that was sort of transitory. What are some of the trade-offs that you think a co-CEO model has, and we may as well talk about the benefits as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When we set up this model, I think it's fair to say that nobody endorsed it. It was not an encouraged one, and even having done it, like I don't know if I could, if two other people came and said, "Hey, should we do this?" Like you can't say yes to that, right? Like because I think it takes a very sort of I think specific and relationship to have together that again is not one that I necessarily always endorse. I think the context for us was that we, in some ways, we're both ex-consultants. You look at us on paper that you think we're pretty similar, but we're actually very, very different people with very different sort of strengths and interests. But we're also really close friends. We've known each other for a decade plus now. We have a lot of trust, and I think the thing that we both bring really effectively to it is low ego, right? Like, and I think that's the thing that's made it work for us, is that neither of us spend too much time worrying about our own position, or how we reflect on other people, or how if I say something that disagrees with Dan, how that reflects on him, or yada yada. Like we spend our time in our sort of exec meetings bickering with each other, basically like an old married couple.
And your board meetings.
Also our board meetings. Dan's on our board, so he can vouch for that. But being able to be open about that and have that as a dynamic, while also still having that real like strong grounding of trust, I think has been the thing that's made it really work. There, would I endorse it for other people? Like I still probably can't publicly endorse it as a one, but I think if you've got the right pairing there, it works. And what it does mean is that both of us can do events like this, right? Like nobody here is a bit offended because they didn't get the CEO to appear. Likewise, it does help manage some of the internal politics, right? Like your senior execs want to be able to report to a CEO. They don't want to report to a COO or some of these sort of things. So actually having that as the title, it does actually create quite a lot of leverage if you can manage the egos sufficiently.
Great. Another one from the crowd, which a really important one on mental health and how, hard to find a lot of jobs that have as much pressure as being founder CEO, founder other role. How have you managed that along the journey?
Yeah, it's a really good one. I mean, so we really started to get momentum basically in the bushfire season of 2019, 2020, the summer just before COVID. And that's when we really started to grow quite quickly. Started hiring people and raising additional amounts of money. And then right at that moment, COVID happened, obviously. And for all of us here, we all obviously experienced a lot of the same things. And I found that year a really hard year. In some ways, it was like my most professionally successful year. Business was going incredibly well. The team was going there, but I just really didn't enjoy the actual work itself, just because I lost all that sort of energy and fun and that feeling of being sort of confined to a small spot was hard. And then towards the back end of that year, we also had to do a fundraise during the year. And you asked me earlier for the worst time. That'd be certainly the second worst time, was trying to do a fundraise in the sort of the depths of sort of Melbourne winter lockdown. Was a grim one, because every time you got knocked back, like it hurt more there, and you really only had this small room with terrible weather outside to sort of dwell on those moments. So how did I deal with it? Did I successfully resolve it? I mean, the lockdown ended, so maybe I didn't ever have to wrestle with those demons to that extent. But I think the classics of just trying to stay healthy, trying to have some kind of veiling balance in your life. For me, I often want to have like a project that I'm also working on the side to try and distract me from work, so that I don't just end up down the rabbit hole 12 p.m. at night scrolling through some Excel spreadsheet trying to find some new thing to worry about, or and so on, because like you just can't have that. So trying to stay healthy, trying to have other things. Dan and I both surf, and so that's often sort of the thing that we do each weekend wherever we can, try and get a bit of release. I won't pretend to be an expert, but that's what's worked for me.
You talked about fundraising in that answer, and you sort of talked about it earlier as being one of the strengths of the organization. How have you done that? How have you made fundraising a strength?
Again, you might be able to speak to this one, Dan, yourself. Look, I think we approach probably the few things. One is, we don't think investors are idiots, which is often, I think, one of the traps people.
Core mistake.
They don't have a lot of time to engage a lot of the time, but they're not idiots, and they do understand, and they can go on complex journeys with you, right? Like, you don't have to just have some terrific top line number. You need to be able to present a story that is simple at the start and gets more detailed. But a detailed, complicated business in a convoluted industry is not a barrier to investment, right? Like, and also indeed, doing something hard is a valuable thing. And what investors are trained to sort of pattern match for is that most successes are something that starts with something hard, or has something hard at the core of them. Dan and I are both, again, I think part of the advantage is that we are both each other's biggest critics on these things, right? Like, he and I will pull apart ideas, pull apart your visions, pull apart the ways of talking about things, and really dissect them with each other, and really try and craft it into a clearer, stronger narrative, so that by the time we're out there with investors, we've got something that's really strong. And we put in the time, right? Like, we really, when we're fundraising, it's the top job for both of us there for a period of time. We don't sort of half-ass it. If we're in the market, we need money. We're out there trying to raise, and we're trying to do that really aggressively there.
I mean, I can add a few things to the things that worked for us, for you guys. I mean, there's a lot, but the things we think about at Square Peg when we're investing is this a huge problem? Is this the team to do it? And can we build a differentiated solution here? And sort of they're three of the key questions we're asking ourselves. Obviously, there's a lot that sits under that. And, you guys, I don't need to blow your trumpets, but the way you and Dan think about the markets was incredibly detailed. Yes, it's a complex industry, but you also mentioned something earlier in terms of your customers, in terms of being able to simplify that for them and delight them early. And so you guys being able to talk through the complexity of the market, but bring it into a way that sort of made a lot of sense and took out. How long have we been involved with you guys now?
Four
four plus years. I'm still learning about energy markets and how it all works. So to be able to get it to the point where you can get, cut through the noise and speak to the things that investors are thinking about. And I think the other thing you've done throughout the journey is never raised with your backs against the wall. You've always had plenty of foresight into what's coming, been clear about why you're raising now, what the story is, where this next round of capital, I should say, gets you in terms of de-risking or next milestone, or the business looks completely different after this raise because we do X, Y, and Z, and that's been really clear and I think super helpful for us. Another one from the crowd is around how team composition has changed. So just sort of thinking about the particular question around sort of percentage of headcount in different functions, so across marketing and product and tech and those kind of things, and how that's evolved over time, and how you sort of thought of, that's where the question ended, but I think it'd be good to hear about how you think about looking around the corner, so not just where it is today and how that's moved, but how you think about positioning the company moving forward, and how you think about team composition from that point of view.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. Maybe even before that, I'd probably put a step back, because I think one of the very simple parts of business, but one of the parts that as you're doing, certainly a business like ours, becomes incredibly meaningful, is like the difference between fixed and variable costs, and how you try and approach that and leverage that as an organization. So everything that we do at Amber, sort of, if you do it the by the book way, has an incredibly high fixed cost, right? Like the initial outlay to be able to do the things that we're doing, and we're certainly where we are today, there's a high regulatory cost that involves lawyers and expensive things, and long, tedious applications to regulators. Building the technology is expensive. Setting up the processes expensive. There's a lot of things that have very high fixed costs, and so a lot of the things we had to do at Amber was we were trying to present a whole different business model. We had a whole long series of risks. We couldn't raise the amount of money we needed for the fixed costs at the start, right? When I'm a team of one, that just wasn't a possibility. And so what we did was we found ways to variabilize a lot of the costs there. And that then flows through into your org chart, right? So in some ways, at the early times of Amber, like we were probably light on the developer side compared to what we would like to be. And that was because we just didn't have the capital to fund the fixed costs that we needed for the journey. And then as we've gone through this journey, a lot of it's been about raising additional capital to fund fixed costs that then pull down variable costs over time, right? So once as we started to de-risk some of the core idea of like, will anyone buy a product where the price changes every 30 minutes? Then once you've got that de-risked enough that you can be like, well, some people will, you can then start to raise more money to then take some of your variable costs and go through the regulatory application processes to get your own license rather than borrowing somebody else's, or build out the technology to be able to do something in an automated way rather than relying on sort of operational headcount to be able to do it in a manual way. So to take some of those costs and turn them into fixed costs. So at the moment for Amber, I think in headcount wise, about a third of our company sort of engineering and product. They're probably 50% to 60% of our payroll. But certainly in terms of headcount, it's about that. And then it's about a third on the sort of operational ones, and then a third on between marketing and overheads. Is the sort of mix. We have lawyers and finance people and so on. But that is and that is the highest I'd say it's ever been in terms of the engineering side. And at the moment, like this is probably the first time over the last year where the company actually felt well balanced to me, where we could actually really make progress on sort of the technology side and the engineering side. We'd always had incredibly capable developers, but there hadn't been as many of them as we would have liked. And so to be able to actually build that out there has been, in some ways, one of the more satisfying parts, because all of a sudden you can see the efficiencies you get. You see the way you're actually able to pull down those variable costs and get really, really efficient and effective on that side.
Everyone just keep questions coming and keep the upvotes. This is the most upvoted question. So how have your competitors adapted or reacted since Amber came into the market?
Yeah, a really good question. One of the things that probably Dan and I are both a little bit guilty of is we think things like too much like sort of business and strategy consultants. So forgive me here, but one of the views I really take is that if you're going to try and tackle a big established industry that's going through rapid change, right? Like, and the sort of the massive change that's hitting the energy industry is obvious. It's the uptake of renewables and the shift to powering your grid by wind and solar. You have to try and find a way to be counter-positioned, right? Like you have to try and find a way that makes it hard for your competitors to do the exact thing you're going to do. And I think you're seeing a lot of other your industries or similar industries where particularly B2C industries where startups have come and been able to do something new, but they haven't actually been that strongly counter-positioned against incumbents. And so often incumbents have moved quickly, both on a product side to copy them. So certainly for us, incumbents move very quickly to eat up your different marketing channels, right? Like you unlock something there, they will observe it. It's not that hard to copy. They will move quickly to move into that space. But the fundamental we have with our business model is that it's very, very hard for a competitor to move to that space without basically stopping everything they're doing, rebuilding their fundamental core systems, retraining everyone that works there for a completely different way of working and then doing it. And so that's meant that nobody else really has done what we're doing. Certainly, there's a few internationally, but in Australia, I think when we were pitching to Square Peg, they were like, but won't there be someone in a year? We're like, well, we don't think so. And I think that's proven to be the case sitting here 4 or 5 years later, is that other people look at it and say, well, that might be the future, but fuck, it's hard right now, right? Like, and we can't do it, and would sort of cannibalize our core business too much, and it would be too much of a wrenching one, and maybe they'll just fail. And so that's, I think it's both our biggest challenge, right? Like we're trying to do something different in the market, but I think ultimately it's the only way we have a shot at winning and having an impact is because of that kind of positioning.
Yeah, I think the biggest change I've seen, a mate SMS'd me the other day. He said, I just got this from AGL saying, if I turn off my power from 6 till 7, I'll save $5 or something along those lines. That was about the extent of savings.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, AGL are training their customers to then go across to Amber, right?
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
if they're doing that, then it's like, well, I mean, if you like that, Amber is the place for you. So, yeah.
Coming out of the pandemic, shift from work from home, hybrid, talk to us about how you manage that through and then post, and particularly around culture, communication, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly a company that's been shaped by the pandemic, right? Like before, those first lockdowns hit, I think we had maybe 4 people on the team there. And so, as that happened, we went fully remote and have been a sort of, remote first organization ever since then. But we've also always made the decision that we're still a Melbourne dominated company. So we haven't gone sort of full distributed. 80 to 90% of our staff are in Melbourne and Melbourne based. And so we, as that is lifted, we have gone back to an office. And so we've sort of been a remote first, but hybrid organization. So we've got an office in the CBD that, I think we have in Melbourne, we have about 60 employees, but the office can sit about 35, which is, about the max we'll ever get there at any one point in time. And so that's, I think worked well for us so far. It's meant that we can still have that sort of the culture, the bonding, the opportunities to really, enjoy each other's company there, while also sort of, allowing people to work from home. We have some people who just do not like coming to an office. And so we can, that works for us, right? Like that's okay there. But it also, I think, taught us, and the advantage of the pandemic was obviously it taught us how to have to communicate, in a remote setting, right? Like, and I think it taught us, especially, not to rely too much on Zoom calls, right? Like you learn the lesson very quickly that nobody wants to be in more than 2 hours of Zoom meetings a day at anything. So you have to try and be able to be asynchronous. You have to try and spend more time writing. You want to record as many of your big meetings as you possibly can, so that people who can't make it are able to watch them at their own leisure. These sort of good hygiene factors that I think are just better ways of working, right? Like that you can bring them in, and you can always default back to an in-person synchronous meeting there, but having the ability to work for as much as possible, I think asynchronously in a written form and in ways that let people absorb information in the way that works best for them, just give you so many more options work effectively with the company.
Bit of a detailed question around the model, but would be remiss of us for the fangirls and boys not to ask this one. The model's all around guaranteeing, well, sorry, the model's not all around, but the model is around selling wholesale prices. What you do with that is guarantee customers, won't pay more than the default price. Given the volatility in wholesale prices, how do you manage that?
Yeah, so the whole premise of Amber, and we'll try and answer this as quickly as possible, but the whole premise of Amber is this dynamic that as we move to a world powered by renewables, we basically have certain times of the day where energy is abundant, right? Like we have actually just too much wind and solar flowing into the grid. Power is free, use as much as you want, right? Like, turn that air conditioning down, right? Like it's totally fine. It's all renewable energy at those points in time. And then at other points in time, as the sun is setting and there's no wind available, all of a sudden supplying energy becomes incredibly hard. And at the moment we rely on coal and gas, and that's when coal and gas generators make almost all their money, right? Like that's the time that they're charging crazy high prices there. And so what we do is, because that availability and the price of energy is driven by supply and demand, what we do is we pass through those real-time prices through to customers, so that basically encouraging people to be able to actually take advantage of that, use more power at the time that it's cheap and green. If you've got a battery, actually feed back in at the times that the grid really needs it and actually earn that amount of money. So that's always been the sort of the premise of Amber, but also, energy markets can go effing crazy, as we saw last year. And one thing you never want to do is have a full exposure there for customers, right? Like you need to be able to cover the tail risks, and particularly the idea of like, again, a Russia invades a hypothetical country, and all of a sudden, there's a global gas shortage and energy prices worldwide are 5 to 10 times higher than they were. So you need to have protection in place for that. So we've always been in the market buying products to try and cap that tail risk and be able to provide to customers a guarantee that over a period of time they won't do worse than X cents per kilowatt hour. And so thankfully there are products in the market that we have been able to purchase there that basically then protect us on the other side. So last year was probably the most acute sort of example of that, and things didn't go perfectly. Obviously, in the real world, you can never balance your risks perfectly, but we're very well protected over the tail. We're in a position to be able to guarantee our customers and look after them, and so overall that worked pretty well.
Awesome. We're jumping around a bit, but such is what happens with great audience questions. You talked about right at the start, sort of that how do I get that first customer, and what does that feel like? The question is around sort of what did that really early growth look like? So first customer, and then moving from first to second to third to 10th to 100th. What was that early journey look like? Did that look like from a customer growth perspective? And then the follow-on, I guess, is sort of what started to change within the org as you sort of realize, oh shit, someone is willing to pay for this. Actually, lots of people are willing to pay for this. What starts to change, and how do you manage that rapid shift?
Yeah. So I mean, the very first customers, like their friends, their family, they don't really care about what you're doing except that you're doing it, right? Like they're very just invested in you. And like I think our very first customer basically never has opened the app, like didn't understand energy, but like was the kind of person who was willing to fill out an online form. And so great friend of mine, love her to pieces. So that's your very first handful of people, right? Like, and what you're really trying to do is just check that shit works there. And then you're trying to find, actually, how do you find the pockets of customers who do care? And so, as I say, it's affectionately, but there are chunks of energy nerds in Australia, and God bless their souls, and they get off on the ability to do things around energy. And so really for us, it was about trying to find those people, and the people who wanted to engage in this. And so Twitter was sort of the first part for that. And then I think the other thing that became a real lesson for us, we were in StartMate early on, and I think the single biggest benefit of StartMate for us was this kind of subtle one, apart from some of the amazing people I met and some of the connections, but it was a subtle one that all of a sudden you had a relatively large community of people who were unusually kind to you, right? Like they basically had a vested interest in your success. They were all sort of small investors indirectly in your company, and would just say nice things about you a lot of the time. And even when you didn't really deserve it, they would be supporting you and being out there publicly and being like, oh, Amber sounds really cool. And so that was sort of a way, I think, for us to then break through the early one. And then bit by bit, as we actually improved the product, it actually started to work for people and create value. And then that obviously needs to be the fundamental channel to drive growth over time is then that sort of the product actually is good. It actually does work for people. People do find it valuable, and then they will talk and say nice things about you, not for vested interest reasons. But that was sort of the journey for us over that.
It's a really good point, and I'm really glad we touched on it. The whole issue around leveraging the community around you, and look around this room, there's a bunch of people that can help each other, willing to help each other. How do you think about, and less from the customer side and tapping your friends and saying, hey, come and pay even though you don't look at your energy bills. How have you guys thought about leveraging your networks, people around you that you're close with, people that you might not be that close with, but in terms of advice, mentorship, guidance, those kind of things?
Yeah, I think it's one where there's probably one of the biggest differences between like my co-founder Dan and myself is Dan is like a prolific extrovert. Like he basically like needs to be talking with someone to think something through. And so DK, you can testament that Dan will jump on a call and somehow manage, you're a busy person. He will somehow manage to get 2 hours of your time where you did not have those 2 hours. And you'll often
you guys, I have as much time as you.
And you'll often walk away being like, gosh, that was a great conversation. I'm so glad I spent that time. And so like Dan does that. He reaches out to people, he finds mentors. He has a whole sort of series of people around him that he really, really leverages. And I think that's been a huge asset to the business, is to build those real, genuine, deep relationships. Because that's just the kind of person that he is. I'm a more introverted person. I'd probably do less reaching out and spend more time reading and doing my own thing a little bit. But I think for myself, I do try and push myself to be out there, to be building those connections with people, to be trying to find the people who I really do feel a connection with and spend the time with them and pushing and prodding, and so build that in quite a genuine sense. And then I also try and be active on different things. I spend a lot of time talking to customers. I spend a lot of time, an okay amount of time on sort of Twitter and talking to people on that, and being available there. So that's how I sort of think about it.
Yeah, well, I would say it's the one thing I find not enough people do enough of in this role, in the industry in general, but in the role as founder or CEO. I think too many people have a view too often. I'm too afraid to share my ideas. What if they sound stupid, or someone's going to steal my idea? Or I couldn't disagree more. I mean, there are so many people so willing to help with so many good ideas, and yes, you're going to get a lot of different answers to the same question. That's your role as CEO or leader to think through which one you're going to take. But I would never say, like, the chances that you're going to say something to someone that they're going to use against you, or try and copy your idea or whatever it is just so infinitesimally small compared to the benefit you're going to get from leveraging your network. So that would be a big push for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth of it is, and again, one I try and remind myself of all the time is, and I think it's an apocryphal sort of Abraham Lincoln quote, but is like, the best way to get someone to like you is to ask them to do you a favor, right? Like, and that actually people just love to help, and they just feel really good about you if they've had an opportunity to help you out, and they feel like they've been able to do something valuable. And so yeah, that's Jane asked me to come and do this talk, and I'm now like, oh, Jane's the best there. But it really does work.
We are coming up on time, right? So last question. You got a time machine. You go back. You can go back to just Amber founding days. What is the one piece of advice you would now give yourself? Sell the time machine?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly, I think you have to be naive at the start of starting a business. So probably the one thing I wouldn't tell them is actually anything that actually happened, sort of thing, then, just in case I scared myself off there. But I think, do it. I think, the other one I try and remind myself of is like, you have to be enjoying the journey, right? Like, you cannot be destination focused. Like, this stuff takes a long time. We're at 5 years and it feels like we're at like day one. But you have to actually, the joy of being able to do a startup is this kind of privilege that you get to spend your time and you're investing in something that you care about, right? Like you came up with an idea, you get to bring a team around to working on that idea. You spend all your time worrying about this thing that you've actually brought into the world, and that's this incredible privilege. But you have to just enjoy that journey and that act of it. And so I would just keep reminding myself to enjoy the different steps because they all pass quickly, and you kind of look back on them even more fondly than you actually felt at the time about them.
Awesome. So from everyone here, thank you, Chris, for your time. And from us at SquarePeg, thanks for everything you do for Amber.
Thanks, all.